It's funny how certain creatures don't get on. Cats and dogs, foxes and chickens. But sometimes, against all odds, enemies can become friends. And this story is about such an odd little friendship. In a busy little town, not very far away, there was a church. And in the church lived a mouse whose name was Arthur. Arthur liked living in a church. For one thing, he was very fond of music, particularly if it was loud. Also, if the verger had filled the font, he could go and mess about in his boat or practice the crawl if the weather was warm enough. There were many advantages to living the luxurious life of a church mouse, but Arthur liked it best because it was safe, and he did have a rather special companion. Samson, the church cat, had listened to so many sermons about the meek being blessed and everybody really being brothers that he'd grown quite frighteningly meek and treated Arthur just like a brother. But sometimes Arthur got a bit depressed. One reason for this was his diet. All he ever had to eat were the sweets the boys dropped during choir practice. You might say that it wouldn't make you depressed, but you're not a mouse. It made Arthur fat and bilious, and it didn't do his teeth any good either. But worst of all, he was lonely, for in the whole of that church there was not one other mouse, and when he felt like having a chat, Samson always seemed to be having one of his day-long naps. Then one afternoon, when Arthur was reading, an idea popped into his head, and after checking it with the parson, he rushed out of the church and into the town to put his idea into practice. He almost gave up his idea, but then he thought, if it's always as nasty as this, everybody's bound to agree to my plan. So he hurried on, and only paused once all the rest of the way. He went into the first likely-looking house he came to, knocked at the mouse hole, and introduced himself to the mouse who answered. Straight away, she asked him in to meet her husband, for she knew that anybody who lived in a church must be a pretty decent sort of person. Over tea, they chatted about life and things, but Arthur could see that his new companions were a bit down in the dumps. After tea, they took Arthur on a tour of the premises. "Look at that thing," they grumbled. "People leave them lying about, and they can be dangerous." "And stop that this minute," the mouse mother suddenly shouted. "You could be electrocuted." Furthermore, the house cat had not heard of brotherly love. They had to flee for their lives back to the hole. "We just don't know what things are coming to," they said to Arthur. But when he explained his idea to them, they were overjoyed. "We'll invite everyone round this evening to hear about it," they exclaimed. So, that evening, when everyone had assembled and stopped shuffling and coughing, Arthur stood up, cleared his throat and began, without any beating around the bush. "My idea is this. You all come and live at the church. It's warm, quiet, and I've got Samson the church cat right under my thumb. Almost. The parson says if we do a few odd jobs, we'll be paid in cheese, best quality. He's expecting us tomorrow morning if you want to come." Everybody thought the idea simply splendid. Next morning, all the mice followed Arthur to their new home. One or two things took some getting used to. But on the whole, everything went very well. The mice kept their half of the bargain and worked quite hard every day. They made sure that the flowers were always fresh and artistically arranged. They polished the congregation's shoes while they listened to the sermon. If there was a wedding, then they all went outside to pick up the confetti and rice, which they made into a big rice pudding for supper. As for polishing the brasses, well, everybody loved that, because they could sneak glances at their reflections without appearing to be vain. The parson kept his half of the bargain, too. Each Friday, he put the different kinds of cheese in the vestry. Every evening after supper, the grown-ups sat round the vestry stove and took turns frightening each other with horrible stories about dogs. They meant cats, really, but they always said dogs so as not to hurt Samson's feelings. Samson himself did babysitting, and they didn't mind a bit about hurting his feelings, or any other part of him for that matter. But one Sunday, during the harvest festival service, a terrible thing happened. Samson, who'd suffered a very bad night with the young mice, dropped off during the sermon and dreamt he was back in the days before he was reformed. When he woke up, he found he was not dreaming. He was chasing mice all over the church. It took a bit of time to remember about brotherly love, and by that time it was too late. All the people had started to walk angrily out of the church. One of them said, "Either get rid of those vermin," all the mice had gasped, for no one had ever called them that before, at least not to their faces, "or we'll never come back. And what's more, they'd better not try coming back to their old holes, because they'll be blocked up and there'll be a real cat waiting for them." Here Samson gasped. When the church was empty, everybody turned on him. "I'd heard the sermon before," Samson mumbled, trying to apologize for sleeping through it. It was no good. They would have to go in the morning, because the church had to have a congregation. That night, the mice sat around the vestry stove with their backs turned on Samson and Arthur. But meanwhile, something very, very fishy was going on. Was taking the candlesticks off the altar. They knew he must be a terrible chap because he hadn't bothered to take his hat off in church. "He's stealing them," the mice whispered to each other. But the schoolmouse said in a quaking voice that a man wasn't guilty until proved innocent, and hadn't they better go back to the vestry and think about it calmly, because desertion was the better part of valor. But Arthur and Samson knew they must do something, even though they'd all been sacked. Arthur stepped forward with a fairly resolute expression on his face. "Follow me and be very, Samson gave him a push. "Very, quiet," he whispered. Fortunately, the burglar was wasting time, gloating over the candlesticks. Everybody tiptoed closer, and Arthur tied the burglar's bootlaces together. He had to do it because Samson could only tie granny knots. Then Samson obliged with his party piece. It was supposed to be the song of the nightingale, but everybody else thought it sounded like a policeman's whistle. They counted on the burglar, thinking so too. He did. In his haste to escape the police, or as Samson insisted later, to get outside to see the nightingale, he dropped his sack, spun around, and took a great stride, or rather he would have done if his bootlaces hadn't been tied together. It worried them a bit when he landed on his head, because they thought he might have broken some of the tiles the parson was so proud of. It turned out there were just a few cracks. As for the burglar himself, he appeared to be sleeping like a baby. Everybody had the idea of rolling him up in the carpet. At any rate, everybody said it was his idea afterwards. They all put their shoulders to the carpet and pushed. Suddenly the burglar woke up and started shouting words that even the schoolmouse had never heard before. Then he began to struggle, and the mice had to strain to stop him unrolling himself. "Do something!" they shouted at Arthur. Said Arthur decisively. "There's only one thing to do," he cried. We must ring the bells and summon help. Half of you follow me to the bell tower." And with that, he dashed off like a born leader, except that he went in the wrong direction. And by the time he'd realized his mistake, the others were halfway there, so he had to pretend he'd stayed in the rear to hurry the stragglers along. When he caught up, he found everybody staring in dismay at the bell ropes, which were tied up well out of reach. "Now what?" they all cried. Said Arthur without hesitation. The schoolmouse said that Samson could climb on the back of a chair and reach one of the ropes. But Samson hadn't forgotten the nasty names the schoolmouse had called him in the vestry. "Wolves in spotted sheep's feathers aren't very good at climbing on the back of chairs," he mumbled sarcastically, whilst reaching for the bell rope. But it was no good. Then a mouse who'd lived in the local theatre made a shy suggestion. "I don't know whether it can be done without sky blue ties with sequins on them," he added, "but we could try." So they did, and it worked. and they rang the bells until they thought everyone within a radius of 10 miles must be awake. The townsfolk tumbled out of bed, shouting things like earthquake, Martians, flood, plague, escaped rhinoceros, anarchists, Apaches, fire, the end of the world, locusts, Vikings, burst pipe, students, mad hedgehog, icebergs. But soon, everybody was racing towards the church. When they saw how near they'd come to losing their beautiful candlesticks, the townsfolk got very peevish with the burglar. They seemed to think that he'd got himself rolled up in the carpet through trying to steal that too, but Arthur soon told them how to stretch a point, he and his friends and Samson had trapped the burglar. And after that, of course, there was no more talk of their having to leave the church. The schoolmouse let it be known that he was quite prepared to take the more advanced Sunday school classes in philosophy, horticulture, and train spotting, but everybody just sighed. As for Samson, you might think he was very sorry about his lapse, but you'd be wrong, because he wasn't. The mice had been taking him for granted of late, he thought, and the fact that they were frivolous, giddy creatures was no excuse. They'd learned he was not to be trifled with, and after that, whenever they needed reminding, he would just yawn and say he hoped he wouldn't drop off during the sermon, and then there would be no more giggling and tittering over silly jokes about dogs for at least 2 days. Goodbye. In a certain small town near here, all the people were very proud of their old parish church. They loved its stained glass windows, its carved pews, its fine tower, its shiny brasses, and its solid silver altar candlesticks. But there was one part of it which they didn't seem to care about at all, and that was the vestry roof. The church mice who lived in the vestry cared about it a great deal. Whenever it rained, the water ran in between the broken tiles and poured down on their heads. And Samson, the church cat, cared about it too, because he also lived in the vestry. Unlike most cats, Samson didn't chase mice. Some of his best friends were mice. But in every other way, he was just an ordinary cat. And being an ordinary cat, he absolutely hated getting his feet wet. A fund had been started for the repair of the vestry roof, and Samson and the mice were in charge of the collection. Every evening, they counted the money that had been put into the box during the day and added it to the amount already collected. On rainy afternoons, when there were too many puddles on the vestry floor for them to play bingo or postman's knock or marbles or jacks, the mice often went across to the parsonage to watch the telly. And as they watched, they couldn't help noticing that cats and mice were very popular actors. And one evening, in the vestry, they talked this over. Humphrey said that actors were paid £1 billion a week, plus their bus fares. With that much money, he pointed out, they could not only mend the vestry roof, but buy a patent-expanding, everlasting cake frill for the parson, and perhaps even have enough left over to treat themselves to a packet of cheese biscuits. So, it was decided that Samson, being the only cat present, and Arthur and Humphrey being the cleverest of the mice, they should become actors and earn the money that was needed. Before they went to bed that night, Humphrey and Arthur spent an hour or so brushing up their dancing, their acting, and their singing. But Samson said he wasn't going to bother with all that stuff. He was just going to rely on natural charm and good looks. He went to bed early to make sure he wouldn't have bags under his eyes in the morning. And next morning, Arthur, Humphrey, and Samson called on an actor's agent to see what he had to offer. The agent didn't seem exactly delighted to see them. He didn't even ask them to perform to show how talented they were. They showed him just the same. Humphrey did the Sugar Plum Fairies dance, and Arthur recited The Owl and the Pussycat, and Samson did the Cheshire Cat smile from Alice in Wonderland. He did it twice because it didn't last very long. The agent wasn't impressed. He said that if they'd been seals that balanced balls on their noses, or poodles that rode bicycles, or even fleas that pulled little carts, he could have helped them. But at the moment, things were a bit slack for smirking cats and ballet dancing mice. They were just about to leave, feeling a little downhearted, when an odd-looking gentleman came bursting in through the door. "Great man," he cried, seeing Samson. "Just what I want. A scruffy, uncuddly ruffian of an alley cat to star in my next cat food advertising film." It seemed he was a film director. He told them he was shooting his new film on a South Sea island, so that cats would think that eating tinned cat food was romantic and adventurous. Samson didn't want to be in the film. For one thing, he was sulking about being called uncuddly, and for another, he wanted to act in a film where he married the heroine and lived happily ever after. But the two mice told the director that they were Samson's managers and that he jolly well would be in the film. So that was settled, and the agent reserved 3 first-class seats on the boat train to Southampton. They were to sail for the South Sea Islands on the following day. Next morning, very early, the 3 friends set off, telling the mice that they would be home the day after next, but not to keep tea waiting because the South Sea Islands were quite a long way off and they might get held up in the rush hour traffic. They caught the Southampton boat train, found their reserved seats, and had a comfortable and pleasant journey. Well, fairly pleasant. They seemed to cause a great stir at the quayside. But Samson didn't let it go to his head. When the fuss was over, they went on board, and soon after that, the ship sailed for the South Sea Islands. The South Sea Islands were much further off than they thought. They were on the ship for days and days. Sometimes it was very nice, and sometimes it wasn't. But at last, after changing ships several times, they arrived at a small but romantic South Sea Island, where everyone went ashore and Samson was made up and dressed in his costume. The director showed Samson exactly what he had to do. Just wink roguishly at the camera, then stroll nonchalantly up to the tin of fat cat and take a few masterful mouthfuls, he said. Make all those mollycoddled fireside cats want to eat fat cat so as to be smooth, suave, cool, dangerous, dashing, elegant, arrogant, adventurous and sophisticated, just like you. "Righto," said Samson. But somehow things didn't work out like that. After a day of Samson's acting, the director had a nervous breakdown and came out in a nasty rash. He had to be taken straight home. Samson and the 2 mice were left behind on the island because the director said he'd jump overboard before he'd sail on the same ship with them. They spent a rather scary night under a bush. The 2 mice didn't blame Samson because, as Humphrey said, a fellow couldn't help being born a nincompoop, and they'd be all right because South Sea Islands have plenty of nuts and fish and fruit and things, so they wouldn't starve. He was right about the things, because they saw plenty of those during the night. And the next morning, they found there were nuts, too, and fish. However, they were able to pick some fruit. Humphrey said this would stop them getting dandruff and boils, and one had to think about one's appearance, even on a desert island. Despite this, Samson didn't really fancy bananas, and some of the berries tended to do rather funny things to mouse insides. By midday, they had got very hot and homesick. They thought how nice it would be to be back in the vestry with a lovely cool rain pouring through the roof onto their heads, and they became quite weepy and sorry for themselves. But Arthur blew his nose and said that kind of thing would get them nowhere. They must pull up their socks, stop moping about, and do something practical, like building a boat and rowing home. They weren't quite sure which was the best way to England. Arthur said that they should row to the right, and Samson said they should row to the left, and Humphrey said they would definitely have to row straight ahead. So they decided to zigzag in order to please everybody. As things turned out, it didn't really matter. But they didn't despair. Instead, they explored the island in the hope of finding something useful. And they did. A pile of cheese and sardine sandwiches and a short-sighted old gentleman. They left the bread, because it's not nice to be greedy, is it? And anyway, they only liked bread if it had peanut butter on it. After the cheese and sardines, they went for a stroll on the beach, where they saw something which really cheered them up. A new ship had arrived. Humphrey read the sign on its side and said that all they had to do now was to get discovered, and they would straight away be taken home. They might not be rare on the outside, he said, but anybody could see that they had rare minds. But when the head scientist came ashore, he just glanced at the three friends who were smiling their best smiles and trying to look rare, as he muttered scornfully, "One seedy felis catus and a pair of musculi, how very, very common." And with that, he walked off. They tried stowing away in the scientist's launch, but were discovered before they were halfway to the ship and tossed overboard. If a log hadn't been drifting towards the beach, something very nasty might have happened to them. Even that didn't discourage them. Next morning, they visited the short-sighted old gentleman again. It was a bit of a blow to find that he'd changed to cucumber and watercress sandwiches, but just then Samson had an idea so brilliant that he quite forgot he was hungry. He whispered it to the mice, and they started on it right away. It was really very hard and artistic work, but it was quite fun too, and when they'd finished, they all three looked very, very rare indeed. Then they went back to the beach to wait for the scientists. Humphrey had made up a little speech. He was going to say that, as rare animals weren't very common, they had decided to sacrifice their freedom in the noble cause of science and knowledge. But he didn't get a chance. Before he could open his mouth, the zoologists had whisked them off to the ship. They were clearly not going to find anything rarer than Samson and his two friends, so the ship sailed for England right away. During the voyage, the scientists studied them very carefully, but were so interested in their insides that they never noticed that their outsides were painted. They received a big welcome when their ship docked, and after giving their views on marriage, the common market, pollution, and signing love from an extremely rare animal in hundreds of autograph books, they were rushed off to the zoo. They hated the zoo right from the very start. There was absolutely nothing to do and nowhere to go, and besides, everybody's manners were so appalling. As Humphrey said, how would people like it if a bunch of strange mice came and stared in through their windows all day? After 3 days, they were all fed up with it, and Samson thought to himself, if a fellow can get himself and his friends off a South Sea island by sheer brain power, then a fellow can get himself and his friends out of a silly old zoo. So he pondered for a while and had another brilliant idea. He carefully washed off the red spots, and then he called the keeper. "I've got measles," he groaned. "I know I have, because when a rare, exotic, red-spotted creature like me catches measles, instead of coming out in red spots, the ones he already has go in." So he was rushed off to the zoo hospital, where he was put in a room all by himself because of being contagious as well as rare. There, he quickly washed off the rest of the paint so that he looked his old self again. Then he walked boldly out of his room and down the corridor to the back of the mice's cage, and no one spared him a second glance, because now he was just a rather common-looking ginger tomcat. He snatched the mice from their cage and bolted. Luckily, the surprise had given him a head start. Once they were safe, he dunked the mice in a puddle to wash the paint off them, and then they found a lift. Within a few hours, they were home. And what a welcome they received when they entered the vestry. Arthur said with a lump in his throat that it made all the unspeakable, terrible hardships that they had endured on their travels worthwhile. They weren't even disappointed that the travellers had come back without the money to repair the vestry roof. "After all," said Samson, it takes more than a leaking roof to dampen the feelings of true friendship." Then he blushed, because he didn't usually say such sloppy things like that. Goodbye. Early one Friday afternoon, Arthur and Humphrey, the leaders of the church mice, were strolling in the churchyard, grumbling about how small the portions of pudding had been at lunch. Humphrey was saying that prominent members of society, like themselves, should have double helpings. And Arthur was agreeing and saying that somebody should do something about it, when suddenly they saw something that made them think that somebody had done something about it. But they didn't think so for very long. They let out such a mighty squeak that all the other mice who had been lounging about gossiping came running up to see what all the fuss was about. And Samson, the church cat, who'd been enjoying a good scratch in the porch, came running up too. They were just in time to see a van go hurtling up the street. The mice all started wailing and wringing their paws and moaning about how Arthur and Humphrey were gone forever and ever. "To solve a crime, you've got to have a clue, and Woe-Mump is a clue," Samson said. "Find Woe-Mump, and you've found those two silly mice, and I know just where to begin the search." Then he said something about it being elementary, my dear Watson, to a mouse whose name he knew quite well wasn't Watson, and hurried off. When the mice were sure his back was turned, they all looked at one another and tapped their foreheads knowingly, but they followed him just the same. He found what he wanted without any bother, and as there was still an hour or two until tea time, he decided to start his investigation there and then. So he sent the mice back to the vestry where they lived, because they would only get under his feet. Then he set off on his search. It did seem an awful long way. He thought to himself, missing tea for the sake of friendship is one thing, but missing tea and supper is another. And he was on the point of turning back and leaving the mice to sort out their problems by themselves when he saw the signboard. So he decided that he might as well carry on with his search now he was on the spot. He had no trouble getting into the place because the guard really didn't have things very well organized. And once in, he found his friends in no time at all. The poor mice were having a terrible time. They cheered up a bit when they saw Samson, but it's very difficult to stay cheered up when you're being rotated, oscillated, accelerated, gyrated, vibrated, and undulated, even if it is for the sake of progress. They might not have been very cheerful, but they were very puzzled. They knew they were being made into astronauts, but they weren't quite sure what an astronaut was. When the scientists had run out of nasty things to do, they went, leaving a pile of books which they said the mice had to read from beginning to end before they got a bite of supper. Samson watched all these goings-on in a terrible rage. "They may only be mice," he said to himself, "but even mice have feelings. I've never treated mice as badly as that, and I've had the excuse of being a cat." Still, there was nothing he could do for his friends until morning. So he made a quick tour of the grounds and then looked for a nice warm place to curl up in for the night. He soon found one, though there wasn't much room in it at first because it was full of wires. But after he disconnected them all, it was just big enough for him to creep into and make himself snug and cozy. He had a good night's sleep and got up fairly early in order to connect all the wires again. He didn't put them back exactly as he'd found them, but he did think that his way was a big improvement, artistically speaking. When he went to look in on his friends, he was surprised to find that they'd been moved to a larger room, which was full of people. The mayor and town councillors were there, making speeches, and there were lots of reporters, taking notes. The mayor said proudly that Wurtlethorpe would be the first borough council to put a mouse on the moon. Everybody was more interested in listening to the scientists who were showing off the capsule in which the two mice would travel to the moon. They were particularly interested in the television camera, which the scientists said would send back pictures of the moon and comets and things. Then the two mice were popped into the capsule and told to strap themselves in. A reporter asked how they were going to get back from the moon, but the scientists pretended not to hear and went on to say that blast-off was scheduled for 2:00:0436 seconds after 11, so there was just time for everybody to get a quick cup of tea. When they'd finished their tea, it was time to launch the two mice into space. But what followed wasn't quite what they'd expected. the rather strange takeoff was due to Samson's rewiring, who knows. At any rate, he felt very sad walking home because he thought he would never see his friends again. And it had been nice having someone around to feel so superior to. The mice weren't feeling a bit sad. They were too busy feeling sick, frightened, and dizzy. They kept their eyes tightly closed and told each other in rather weak, trembly voices that being an astronaut was really lovely. Suddenly, it seemed to go rather quiet, and after a few minutes, there was a terrific splash, and everything came to an abrupt halt. And just at that very moment, Samson reached the riverside path on his way home. When the mice opened their eyes again, they thought they must have landed on the moon, because a rather horrible monster was peering through the window at them. But when the water had run off the glass, they saw that it was only Samson, and they were so relieved that if they hadn't been trapped inside, they would have given him a big kiss, even though he didn't like that kind of thing. All the rest of the day, they drifted slowly downstream. Inside the capsule, the two mice argued about whether or not the moon was further away than London, while outside, Samson was wondering why poets were always writing poems about swans. But at last, just as the first stars were starting to show, Wurtlethorpe Church came into view around a bend. Samson swam ashore and hurried to the vestry to round up the mice. By the time the capsule came abreast of the church, Samson and the mice were ready and waiting. Ever since blastoff, the two scientists had been trying to make the TV set work so that they could see the pictures the rockets were sending back to Earth. They'd tried scientific methods, then they'd kicked it, and then they'd shaken it, and then they'd sworn at it, and then they discovered that it wasn't plugged in. And by the time the capsule was ashore with its camera pointing at the sky, the first thing the scientists saw when they finally got the set going was a picture of the moon. "The moon!" they cried excitedly. "They're nearly there!" Back at the church, Samson had decided to drag the capsule into the vestry, where there was light to see by as they worked to free Arthur and Humphrey. And meanwhile, the scientists' eyes were fixed on the TV screen. The next thing they saw would have made most people give up science forever. But when they got over the shock, the two scientists agreed that they hadn't seen what they'd seen, because if they had, it would really prove that certain things existed which every good scientist knew jolly well didn't. But they still had to go out and calm their nerves with a cup of instant coffee and a pork luncheon meat sandwich. And while they were doing this, Samson and the mice dragged the capsule into the vestry and laid it on its side in order to get Arthur and Humphrey out. The TV camera in the capsule's nose now pointed straight at the mice's weak supply of cheese, brought for them by the parson that very morning. Back in the vestry, the first thing that Arthur and Humphrey did on getting out of the capsule was to have a quick snack, even before they started bragging about being the first astronautical church mice in history. This nearly made the two scientists faint with delight. "It's edible!" they shrieked. "This is the greatest discovery since non-stick frying pans. Our names will rank with Newton and Darwin and Elvis Presley." They telephoned all the newspapers to tell them about their discovery, and they invited lots of reporters to come down next morning to see it for themselves on the TV set. Next morning, after they'd read all the nice things the newspapers had to say about them, they were without doubt the two happiest scientists in the world. After breakfast, the scientists started to prepare the conference room, and they finished just as the reporters started arriving. They had all brought packed lunches with them because they expected to be there a long time. By 10 o'clock, the room was full, and everybody waited eagerly for the mayor to switch the set on. Meanwhile, back in the vestry, the capsule had been put to one side out of the way because things got pretty lively there on a Sunday just before morning services began. When there was complete silence in the conference room, the mayor made a few brief remarks about man's glorious destiny and onward march of knowledge, and then he solemnly switched on the TV, saying in a trembling voice, "Ladies and gentlemen of the press, behold the moon." What they saw was much better than most things you see on telly, but it wasn't what everybody had been led to expect. The reporters were very angry indeed, and they put their packed lunches to a use that was certainly never intended for them. Then they rushed off to write extremely nasty things about the mayor and town councillors of Wurtlethorpe in their newspapers. Then the mayor said things which can't be printed to the scientists, and the scientists said things which are best forgotten to the mayor. And the result of all that was that the scientists were given their cards and 5 minutes to pack their bags and clear off the premises. Some days later, the mice and Samson saw the two scientists again. Arthur and Humphrey were boring the fur off everybody with yarns about gravitational pull and computerized orbits, while Samson had yet another 40 winks, making a total of 15,320 so far. And it was still only 3 o'clock when a strange sound from the street brought everyone outside. Now, mice don't usually bear grudges, and even though Arthur and Humphrey had been so abominably treated by the two men, they were really rather pleased to see them getting on in the world and doing something useful at last, instead of wasting their time playing with fireworks. Arthur even suggested borrowing a penny from the Save the Vestry Roof Fund collecting box to give them. But Humphrey, very sensibly, said that before giving the penny, it would be best to wait until they could play something else beside the first 2 bars of My Love Is Like a Red, Red Rose. Otherwise, they might think that success had come too easily and stop trying. Goodbye. One July morning in Wurtlethorpe, a few of the vicar's friends gathered outside the vicarage to see him off on his summer holidays. When the coach had gone, they chatted about the new curate who was coming to take over for the next few weeks. There wasn't much to say because no one had yet met him, but they all hoped he'd be a nice, quiet young man like the one they'd had last year. He wasn't. Schoolmouse was very impressed with him. The rest of the church mice and Samson the church cat reserved judgment. Later, they all went back to the vicarage to see how the new curate was settling in. Humphrey was even more impressed. Everybody else was non-committal. The next morning, Samson and the mice went into the churchyard and spent the whole day sunbathing. When they returned to the vestry at tea time, they found that during their absence, the curate had made a few changes. Even Humphrey wasn't too keen on these, but everybody agreed that given time, a chap's eyes can get used to anything. After tea, the mice usually sat under the surplice cupboard and listened to the choir practicing hymns like From Greenland's Icy Mountains. It seemed that the curate had made a few more changes. Humphrey wasn't too keen on these either, but they all agreed that given time, a chap's ears can get used to anything. Next day brought the worst change of all. Every Friday, by a long-standing gentleman's agreement with the vicar, their weekly allowance of cheese in payment for services rendered was brought to the vestry. Now, late on Friday evening, there before their very eyes, plain for all to see, was absolutely nothing. They were thunderstruck. And this time they all agreed that eyes and ears were one thing, but a chap's stomach was sacred. So they sent a deputation across to the vicarage to protest to the curate. Unfortunately, he was terrified of mice, and their visit made him quite hysterical. He told Samson that it was a church cat's duty to catch church mice, not to hobnob with them, and if Samson didn't do his duty, he'd find a proper cat who would. Samson's vow never to harm mice had given him a lot of trouble in the past, but never as much as this. The vestry was a dreary place that night, until Arthur, who had a practical turn of mind, thought up a plan. It was very simple. When the curate next appeared, Samson would pretend to be catching the last few mice. After that, they'd hide, and the curate would think they'd all been caught. The plan worked well. It didn't solve the cheese problem, of course, but the mice were prepared to change their diet until the vicar came home. But from Samson's point of view, the plan had obvious drawbacks, and he infuriated the mice by thinking up a new one. It was an even simpler plan than Arthur's, and it had to do with the curate's mouse phobia. They would frighten him so much that he would run away and never come back. It would have worked, too, if the mayor hadn't been driving past in his brand-new Rolls-Royce. Samson and the mice got all the blame, of course. The mayor was furious with them and shouted things like vermin and fleabag, and told them it was the likes of them who were tarnishing the noble name of Wurtlethorpe in the eyes of all mankind. After all that, they thought they'd better lie low for a time, so they went and rummaged on the municipal rubbish dump. Then, after a couple of hours, they went back to the church to see if the trouble had blown over. It was worse than ever. In fact, things were so bad that they were even willing to listen to Humphrey. He said that, speaking as a chap who kept his finger on the pulse of the times, he thought what was needed was a protest march. As no one had any other ideas, they decided to give it a try. They had chosen a good time, because that afternoon the curate was giving his first garden party. The mice thoroughly enjoyed the march, and even Samson entered fully into the spirit of things. That night, they had to camp out in the Lich Gate, because the new church cat was sleeping in the vestry. But they were happy, because now the mayor knew all about their cause, and was sure to do something about it soon. He did do something. First thing the next morning. Whether the mice escaped through divine intervention, as Humphrey claimed, or by sheer fluke, as Arthur claimed, no one will ever know. But escape they did, and set off to look for Samson. Finding him didn't prove too difficult, but getting him out of the cage under the noses of all the other cats was another matter. Humphrey said it was a pity he had never studied hypnotism, because then he would have put the cats to sleep. And Arthur replied sarcastically that it was a pity that he'd never studied magic, because then he could have made all the cats disappear. As it was, they'd just have to stoop to trickery. When Samson was out of the cage, Humphrey tied the door shut with a knot of his own invention called the Humphrey Patent Double-Reefed Running Sheepshanked Granny Knot Mark II, which he personally guaranteed absolutely unslippable. It slipped. And the sight of all those cats going free was more than any dog could take sitting down. Samson first realized they were being pursued when they were getting near the vicarage. Inside the vicarage, the curate was taking a bath, and as he wanted to listen to groovy Grumble's rock roundup on Radio Wurtlethorpe, he had left the bathroom door open. That was a mistake. Samson and the mice were now on home ground and soon found a hiding place. But outside, there was no hiding place for the curate. That day, at enormous expense, the new European tea cosy and muff wing of the Wurtlethorpe Museum was being opened, and to mark the occasion, a procession was taking place, headed by the most important people in the whole county. And the curate met them all. The meeting was not fruitful. He resigned on the spot. The curate decided to leave next morning. Wurtlethorpe, he said, was not his scene. A telegram was sent off to the vicar at Bognor, and he gladly cut short his holiday. He immediately gave Samson 6 tins of new fat cat with added biopolychlorodiamine for personal freshness, and the mice received double rations of cheese because they had all had to put up with so much. Soon the choir was practicing from Greenland's icy mountains again, and the paintings in the vestry were covered with a nice shade of buff paint, which looked as if it had been on the walls for 25 years before it was even dry. Goodbye. Humphrey the schoolmouse had been reading again. One pleasant afternoon in Wurtlethorpe churchyard, he began to lecture his fellow mice. "We've become victims of the rat race," he told them, "crushed by the pressures of modern life. Our nerves are being torn to shreds in the mad struggle for survival." At this moment, everyone went indoors for tea. But during tea, he started up again. "We must escape the toils of society," he declared. "We must seek the woods and fields where we can gambol amidst the buttercups and have our fevered brows soothed by the cool fingers of Mother Nature." Just then a crumb went down the wrong way, and his friend Arthur had to take over. "A weekend in the country will do us all good," Arthur said. "And speaking as a practical sort of chap, I suggest a party leaves each Saturday morning, gets its fevered brows soothed, and returns in time for tea on Sunday. Samson will act as escort. He'll have to give up all his weekends, of course, but he won't mind." Samson woke up long enough to say he jolly well did mind, and then tried to get back to sleep. But by this time, the mice had got Humphrey's message. They made it very clear that their return to nature was not to be spoiled by Samson's selfishness. As a church cat, Samson had taken a solemn vow never to harm mice, so there was nothing he could do but agree. On thinking it over, however, he wasn't too depressed. Mice being mice, it seemed possible that the first outing might be the last. All the same, he made a secret wish that something terrible would happen just to be on the safe side. That evening, Arthur organized the drawing of lots to make up the first party, and Humphrey brought out his map and explained exactly where they'd be going. The following morning, they set off early. In stretches, the going was a little tough, but even a church cat has his pride. And when the mice were out of danger and Arthur said, "Now you'll see why I brought you, old chap," Samson did not reply. He just wondered what happened to cats that broke vows. When they reached the riverbank, they began to enjoy the peace and quiet of the countryside. After they'd enjoyed quite a lot of peace and quiet, Arthur, who'd found a boat, suggested a river trip. Everyone thought this a splendid idea, even Samson, though something made him faintly uneasy. He couldn't think quite what. But it wasn't long before he remembered. Luckily, everyone held on tight, because when they surfaced, they found themselves being tossed by gigantic waves. "We've been washed out to sea! All is lost!" shrieked the mice. However, in due course, their boat hit a rock, and they were able to struggle ashore.
"When Mother Nature has finished soothing our fevered brows, perhaps she could give us a jolly good rub down as well,"
said Samson bitterly, as they stood dripping by the water's edge. This made Humphrey very angry. "Here we are, cast up on a foreign and exotic shore, and all you do is make silly jokes," he snapped, studying the map, which had got a little damp. "According to my calculations, we're in China," he said, "probably on the Pongyang Peninsula."
"We're in Wurtlethorpe Park,"
mumbled Samson. "Rubbish!" cried Humphrey. "Look over there. We're in India. Cats know nothing about geography." This was too much for Samson. If the mice wanted a foreign and exotic shore, they could have one.
"Crumbs, you must be right. Here comes a greater spotted Indian mouse-eater," he cried. "Run for your lives!"
But they hadn't run far when he shouted,
"Stop! A lesser scarlet Indian mouse-swallowing water snake."
With mouse-eaters behind and mouse-swallowers ahead, the mice were convinced their last hour had come. Samson was heard to remark that creatures who were just walking dinners should have stayed at home in the vestry, but all the same, he showed them a way to escape, and they got past the water snake safely. But Arthur and Humphrey grumbled about how they could have been having a nice cosy tea now if it wasn't for some people's rotten ideas about Mother Nature and weekend trips. Finally, Samson, who never stayed bad-tempered for long, decided to take pity on the mice and lead them home by a shortcut he knew across the sandpits. But as soon as he saw the sand, Humphrey resumed command. "My calculations are correct," he announced importantly. "We have reached the Sahara Desert." Samson pointed out a steeple and some oak trees and said you didn't see many of those in the Sahara, but Humphrey only looked at him pityingly. "There are such things as mirages, you know," he said. "Deserts are full of them. Cats know nothing about natural science." Samson stopped feeling sorry for the mice and followed grimly along behind as Humphrey led them into the trackless wastes of the Sahara. They were soon hot, thirsty, and lost. And if Arthur hadn't spotted the oasis, there's no saying what might have happened to them. But a drink and a dip soon made them feel better, and they might all have succumbed to the spell of the desert if Humphrey hadn't insisted on giving a long lecture on the origins of curious rock formations found by Humphrey in an uncharted region of the Sahara, which didn't last as long as he'd intended.
"Arthur!"
shouted Arthur.
"Every mouse for himself!"
Fortunately, there was only one way to run. The Sahara ended at the river, where they scrambled onto a branch of driftwood because Humphrey said it was dangerous to stay on land in the vicinity of a seismic fault. "We are now in the Mediterranean Sea," he announced. "If we turn right at Gibraltar, we should be home in time for dinner." It took some time to cross the Mediterranean, but eventually they reached the opposite shore. It seemed rather thickly populated, but they saw that someone had very kindly left a line for them to make fast to. "Ahoy there, my man!" shouted Humphrey. "Is that England?" The man shouted back something rather rude, but very British, so they knew they were home at last. Once more on British soil, there were some very emotional scenes. Humphrey said a few words about Britannia welcoming her wandering sons back to her bosom, and Arthur hummed Land of Hope and Glory. Everyone agreed that now they'd seen the rest of the world, you couldn't beat good old England, except that it was rather late and beginning to rain. As the mice got colder and wetter, they began to say that England was going to the dogs, and everyone agreed it was little wonder people emigrated and went abroad for holidays. Then the rain stopped, the moon appeared, and everyone agreed that it was awfully nice to have changeable climate, and they couldn't understand why people went abroad at all. Arthur and Humphrey stepped out into the open to take a quick bearing on the pole star and set a course for home. Humphrey was just remarking on how lovely it was to live in a country where a fellow could walk about at night in perfect safety, when an absolutely terrible thing happened. At first, they were too shaken to speak. But after a while, Humphrey said in a trembly kind of voice, "Apropos of nothing, what do barn owls
Eat? Small mammals?
Said Arthur. Ah, interesting, said Humphrey. And after they'd flown a little further, Humphrey said in a casual sort of tone, just for the sake of conversation, how big, approximately speaking, would you say small mammals are?
As big as us?
Said Arthur. Ah, yes, interesting, said Humphrey. But when they saw that the owl had brought them to their own church tower, their spirits rose a little. Arthur decided to try the friendly approach. Jolly decent of you to give us a lift, old thing, he said. We'd like to stay for a bit of a chin wag, but it's past our bedtime, so we ought to be toddling. Nighty-night, old sausage. They started to walk away, but they didn't get very far. When the owl was sure they couldn't escape, it dropped off to sleep. The mice could not help feeling things looked a little bleak. Humphrey gave way to morbid reflections upon mortality, but Arthur passed the time more usefully by filling the owl's claw with stones. They thought they'd fooled the owl rather neatly, until they discovered that without mountaineering equipment, there was no way out of the belfry. The owl awoke, feeling agreeably hungry. When it found that its claw was full of stones and its breakfast was attempting a getaway, it lost its temper completely. Humphrey became fatalistic. He said that the hand of destiny was raised against them, the sands of time had run out, the book of fate was closed, and there was no use fighting against what was written in the stars. Piffle, said Arthur, because it jolly well wasn't written in the stars. He thought of a plan. It took them a whole day. Luckily, they found the remains of someone's fish paste sandwich, which kept them going. By nightfall, everything was ready. But the owl had become very suspicious. They decided to wait until morning. When at last the owl finally nodded off, the sun was long up, and they had almost abandoned hope. But it was now or never. Humphrey muttered grumpily that if mice had been meant to fly, they'd have been born with wings. But he was only jealous because it was Arthur's idea. It's a short, pleasant journey from the church to the parsonage, but the way they went was neither short nor pleasant. When they arrived, they were not at all welcome. The parson pointed out that as prominent church mice, they were supposed to set a good example. Much more of this sort of thing, he said severely, and no gentleman of the cloth would be able to take a well-earned glass of port without finding half a dozen mice frisking about in it. He demanded to know which of them was responsible for such a foolish, harebrained prank, and without any hesitation, they told him. And while they had a bit of breakfast, he went on with the talking to. After that, he sent them packing back to the vestry. On the way, they met a friend. Somehow his greeting seemed a bit odd. They soon saw why. At first, everyone was terrified, but when they realized that it really was Arthur and Humphrey and not their ghosts, everyone turned very nasty. They said that the two mice were a pair of wet blankets for showing up in the middle of their own funeral and spoiling all the fun. After a while, however, they calmed down, particularly as something had to be done about the food, and so they had a party instead of a funeral and ended up enjoying themselves in spite of the disappointment. As for Samson, he had a drowsy feeling that the mice of Wurtlethorpe Church would resist the mad pressures of the rat race without further help from Mother Nature, and pleased with his own sagacity, resourcefulness, and patience, he drifted off into a peaceful snooze at last. Goodbye.